Hi, welcome back. My name's Anurag Jain. This is Formative Assessment. This is the sixth podcast in this series that began as a kind of homage to the work of Shirley Clarke and formative assessment, and now has moved into some of the theory of Dylan Wiliam as well. And I hope you are learning and enjoying this series of podcasts that's taking us through the entire gamut of formative assessment. Today we look at, last time we looked at questioning and how questioning could be used as a way of pushing the students to think and also to finding out what they know. Now, this week we're going to talk about feedback, and we're going to talk about something that Royce Sadler talks about, teaching the student to see. But I think we should change this to teaching us all to see. So feedback is a way of actually educating our sight in a way. So I'd like to begin, and again, with all these starters, you should pause to take a moment. I have these two images here. Could you reflect on a time when you've been given too much feedback? When does feedback inhibit your learning? And what's an example of feedback in your life that helped you? Now, what I was thinking was when I first started teaching, and I had a really bad observation, and my mentor at the time was very strong, but he gave me so much feedback, he gave me so much information that at a certain point I was saturated and I don't think I could act. And I got to the point where I could not feel like I could make process as a teacher because there were simply too many targets, too much information coming at me at the same time. Another thing that I think about with feedback is I had a poetry teacher in university, and he talked about writing poetry, and he compared it to playing tennis, and he was talking about the looseness of inspiration and the fine tuning eye of the editor who filters out rubbish from something good. And he said, so you have to be both loose and tense at the same time. And we were all so confused by this comment. He said, I know, it's like with my tennis teacher says the same thing. You have to be loose and you have to be tense at the same time. When you're getting feedback like that, it's almost contradictory. And you have to somehow, as the student, filter through it and somehow make meaning of it. That's really, I think, one of the main ideas we're going to explore today is how feedback is this process that the student themselves have to make sense of. I'm going to just give you these 5 statements to reflect on your thinking on feedback and think about to what extent you agree. Feedback always leads to increased student attainment. Feedback's a lot of work, but it's always the best activity to ensure progress. I regularly spend enormous amounts of time marking. I know it helps my students. If I don't give feedback, they will never know how to progress. Feedback is overrated. Okay, so where would you place yourself? Which statement best reflects your own thinking? There was a macro study of feedback done by these 2 scholars, and what they found was something quite shocking. Kluger and Denisi in 1996 found rather radically that 38% of feedback intervention, what they call FI, actually leads to negative progress in student attainment. Now, if you take that on board, that is not a negligible amount. That's in 38% of the cases, feedback intervention led not only did it not improve, it progress went backwards. With that in mind, does this change where you are in terms of your opinion about what feedback is? And further, if we can think about why is this happening? How could feedback actually harm learning so often and so regularly? I think part of what we might think about there is, certainly in the UK, what became kind of what Stephen Ball refers to as the performativity of teaching versus authentic learning, where feedback, when I started the profession, there was a time where the teacher's marks were in red, the student marks were in green, and then there was another color for the student responses this dialogic insanity in the book, this multicolored peacock feathered book became the arena from which we were supposed to judge all progress. And those ideas that, feedback's something I do for my boss, it's something in red, I tick and flick to show that I've looked at the work. Feedback is something I do to the student. The student uses, in my school, the color green to respond. When verbal feedback, I have to evidence it, because how else would we know that it's occurred if I didn't have a stamp? Feedback is something that signals the end of learning, and it comes from the teacher only. These are kind of ideas that are quite, they're still quite prevalent about what feedback is. And when we place them against the things we've been talking about in this podcast, metacognition, what are we actually doing? What is the student doing? What is the teacher doing? How are they learning about their learning? How can students articulate what they're doing, talk about it, actually reflect on it? How can the teacher do that as well? What of the feedback is linked to the success criteria? What is actually being commented on? And how have those things been demonstrated, been shown, been modeled, and been taught explicitly? Because if they're not, then it's really odd feedback if you're commenting on things that you're not actually teaching on. And finally, kind of like questioning has two objects to make you think and to check on learning. Feedback too should probably do the function of questioning. And if it doesn't do either of those things, what is it actually doing? So all this led to, at my school, certainly a move to move from kind of a compliance notion of feedback to something more professional. And it was a feedback policy that we came up with, and the principles of which are to the right here, all of which I stand behind. That feedback is essential for teachers and students to improve and to learn. For both actors, it's important. Feedback isn't just written. Feedback allows teachers the opportunity to plan opportunities for students to learn more, to improve. Feedback's a skill itself that needs to be taught and practiced. Feedback literacy. Verbal feedback is part of talk culture and is an essential part of feedback. It's continuous, and it goes alongside the learning. It's not an end point. It's a constant process. And that eventually, when we get a talk-rich classroom and we teach students to become agents of their own learning, peer-to-peer feedback is crucial for that advanced learning to take place. So these principles kind of informed the intent of our policy. But what we found is that, the problem is that a policy, however grandiose, however fantastic it sounds, without a concordant or a pedagogy that enables or actualizes it, won't lead to enough progress in student learning. So if you have this policy that's amazing and has all these amazing principles, but you don't have a pedagogy that kind of enables it, all the things on the left, that policy kind of is in fallow ground. It's not moving forward. Incidentally, this is also true of curriculum, which is a very hot topic here right now. You can have the most amazingly written curriculum, sequenced, knowledge recall, cultural capital, all the buzzwords. It could be perfect. I could sell it to you. I can call it mastery learning from ARC and sell it for $14,000 a year. Okay, here it is. But if you don't have pedagogy, it doesn't mean anything. So that's why Dylan William kind of says this pedagogy trumps curriculum, because it looks great on paper, but if it's not happening in the classroom itself, it's not happening. So this is something to think about. Without an integrated, responsive, and strong formative pedagogy, feedback just isn't as effective as it could be. And by effective, I should also say, it's onerous on the workload. Feedback is something that can really burden teachers. Feedback, again, back to this thing I'm saying, it's managerial, it's performative. It becomes something we do for others as opposed to actually for the student themselves. And go back to this idea, if not done well, what does it mean to be done properly or well? It could actually lead to negative progress, and that's brutal. Sometimes I think, okay, why don't we just go back to not draconian, maybe just simplistic. Teacher feedback every 2 weeks in red, students responding great. That could be a really easy way to have a feedback. That's the entire feedback policy, let's say, except for classes that don't see them as regularly, let's say. Because if you're not going to have a pedagogy that backs up these lofty ideas of feedback, what's the point? But the thing is, if you want to move from a culture of compliance to professionalism, which is ultimately what I want out of a school and any school and myself in the profession, I think if we're doing that, teachers and leaders need to really think deeply about the way feedback functions in the learning culture of the school, and actually how feedback is part of a pedagogy as a whole. And furthermore, teachers need to adapt the way they teach and improve the way they teach if they're going to make feedback more impactful. And of course, I would recommend formative assessment, and leaders, and this is something I want to talk about in later podcasts, is actually what do leaders need to do to adapt the way they see the feedback process. So today, look, this is just the axiom that you're going to have to take on board. The most effective feedback is just feedback that our students actually use in improving their learning. It's not the beauty of your book. It's not multicolors. It's actually what they do. So we've already looked at the fact that feedback in and of itself isn't, if it's in isolation, it's not necessarily virtuous. It does not necessarily lead to improved learning. And if it doesn't lead to improved learning, you have to rethink it. So to put it as part of place it within the framework of formative assessment is really important. And then we're going to talk a little bit about motivation, go back to success criteria, and some solutions to make feedback more digestible. Okay, so just again, putting this all together, here is, if we take the podcast I've done so far, what I'm trying to do here is model or map out and define what it is that I'm looking for in a lesson. I'm defining it, I've tried to model it, and what we need to start to do, this is a form of feedback, this is the kind of meta aspect of this this podcast, is what we need to do is to be able to give feedback to one another, to start having better conversations, and coaching and supportive accountability, to actually start manifesting the learning culture that we want. Once we agree, once we can share and define what it is that we're looking for, the next thing we need to learn is a fluency and literacy in giving feedback to one another. And I found this book by Jim Knight really interesting about the way that we have better conversations with one another to help facilitate that. But this, you could pause here and just look, and maybe there are things you disagree with. But this isn't a rubric. These are my expectations. This is the language, the template with which I would like all teachers to be able to talk about what they're looking at when they see a lesson. Similarly, we need to think about what we're doing when we're looking at a book. And what we may want to think about are things like, the curriculum, progression and excellence, and feedback that addresses misconceptions and moves students on to the next steps. So the first thing we'd want, again, I invite you to pause this and look for yourself, but what narrative does my book give when I don't get to speak? When I'm not present, what does this book say about what's going on in my life? I think that's a worthwhile question for teachers to ask themselves. And I think there's a lot of questions and self-reflection that teachers need to be able to ask themselves without completely demolishing their ego or feeling bad, but to be open to begin the conversation about what's going on in my lessons, what's going on in my book. Then in terms of peer-to-peer, that could be line management, but that could also just be collegial. How do teachers articulate the learning of all their students? And can they use their book as one means of facilitating that conversation? What are your students actually doing? How does the learning get manifest in this book? Can we have a conversation about it? And then maybe the trickiest part is, we recently had Ofsted at my school. And, apart from it being an utterly banal and ridiculous process, I could say that one thing that, there was plenty of it that was very important and made me think really deeply and scrutinized my thinking a lot. So I should say that as well. But one thing that really occurred to me is it's essentially an oral exam, that the ability of a teacher, a leader, a student to verbally articulate what's going on is pretty much one of the main things that's being assessed. So it's worth thinking about in terms of the talk culture of a school, in terms of the talk culture of a teacher, also your students, without you there to be interviewed, how do they articulate what it is that they're actually doing in the lesson? That is something that was interesting to watch, and it was really instructive to go through that process through an external body. So I'll give them that. That was one thing that I did learn. Okay, so once we think about, sorry, I'll just go back to this for a second. So what we're trying to do is come up with ways of measuring what's going on in the lesson. Okay, once we do that, what we're going to realize is we need to really think again about where does our pedagogy fit into feedback. And feedback is an important part of the process of formative assessment. So these are from Dylan William. There are three variables: where the learner's going, where they are, and how do they get there. And there are three actors. There's the teacher, peer to the individual, and then the student themselves. Where the learner's going is about the learning intention. And you can think about solo taxonomy. You can think about your curriculum here. Here we get to know, we share the journey with the students. The teacher engineers discussions and questioning to elicit evidence of where the learner is in their learning. And we give feedback. Here's where feedback rests so that the learners can move forward towards their learning goal. Part of today also I'm going to talk about peer, the idea of peer, or there's a community involved. That's not the individual learner, is the activating students as learning resources for one another, and then metacognition, self-regulation, getting students to own their own learning. Okay, so let's move into this first section. We're going back to growth mindsets. We're going to talk about comments versus grades, and I'm going to introduce you to a piece of research on wise feedback. So for feedback to have any impact on students, they actually have to believe they can improve. So if they don't believe that, if they don't believe there's a purpose or that intelligence is fixed regardless of effort, then it kind of demolishes one of the major driving forces of what's going on in the lesson. Now, there's a lot of chatter about some of the replication issues with Dweck's work. I might go so far as to say, psychology itself is suffering a replication crisis. So that I'm not a psychologist, so it's not something I'm going to really query here. But what I'm going to say to you is, I don't know. Just like I don't know, I couldn't prove to you what human nature is. But I have a presumption that human nature is one of creativity and positivity and seeking of freedom. And I act based on that model. Similarly, I have a model of growth mindset for myself as an individual in as many areas of my life as I can. And I try to instill that in my students for everything. Because if they don't have that growth mindset for my subject, for school, it is very difficult to get them to think about moving forward. And feedback without a growth mindset, I just invite you to think about how is it functioning? I don't know. So what we really need to celebrate in our classrooms is difficulty, resilience, getting things done, getting things wrong, celebrating error, making mistakes. This is the culture that we should be feeding back and generating and creating, so that feedback is a positive force culturally. Part of that is this idea about what we give feedback on scores versus comments. So Ruth Butler did this important research in 1988. I got this from Dylan William, but I've read the paper now. She did this study, and she looked at three types of feedback: scores, like numeric marks, comments, scores, and comments. And what she found was that over the course of the year, the comments-only based marking had a bump of 30% gain in their achievement, and this had the same influence on the attitude for both high attainers and low attainers, whereas marks did not have any imprint on the achievement, and it only kind of stimulated those grade junkies, the high attainers. Okay, so and this is, I'm taking from Dylan William again. He gives you this question. So okay, what happened when students were given both scores and comments? Okay, so you could pause if you want to take a beer and talk about it if you're sitting there, or make some notes to yourself. I'll just cut to punchline. It didn't matter, because once students are given scores, the learning's over. Numeric learning fixates the student on their kind of ego identity, comparison, and comment marking focuses on improving. And it's true. You know this. This is from the article itself. This may be the psychological mechanism behind observations that pupils often seem more interested in their own and their friends' grades than in learning. Grades are something we do to compare one another. Grades are something that ends the learning. Comments are constantly, again, getting us back into Robin Alexander's notion, this dialogic. We're constantly discussing. And grades are extrinsic, external motivation. And what we're trying to do in students is get them to find a joy and love for learning that's internal, intrinsic. We're trying to move them away from thinking about themselves in that fixed mindset as a good learner, a bad learner, good mathematician, good language student, good musician, and think about the task itself. My critical feedback has nothing to do with you. You're fine. It's the task that we're talking about. And if you go back to Kluger and Denisi, they argue that what really matters is how students respond and act on feedback. Ultimately, it's what they do with it. It's how they kind of emotionally respond to it that is crucial. And that makes me think that, well, for me anyway, that's led me to read a lot about motivation. And here are 4 books with one-word titles that I've read over the years. And they really, I invite you to read them all. I think they're all great. And a lot of sports motivation is really interesting to read. Flow, range, drive, and peak. What is it that pushes us internally? These are all wonderful books if you're interested in sports motivation, if you're interested in motivation, which you all should be if you're interested in teaching. What is it that drives students to want to do better? Or what drives all of us to want to do better? How can we facilitate that? How can we make feedback part of that structure? Well, some people think praise is part of it. And the thing is that the provision of grades and written praise had no effect on the achievement in her study. And the effect, she says, of praise is it gets the ego involved. And what we need to do is change a student's behavior, is to move away from critiquing the person and going to the task. And praise might be a problem, part of this. So I think I got her name wrong, Gia Brophy. That's the article from 1981. Best teachers don't praise. It's the quality. If you're going to praise, it's the quality of the praise rather than the quantity. Praise works if it's infrequent, credible, contingent, specific, and genuine. Actually, praise is a dangerous thing in the classroom. Now, you could think that it's an effective way of building relationships. And if you do think that the way praise works is by talking about effort, the task, and the things that we're doing, not the individual. As we go to the ego, we move into this fixed notion of who we are and praising that, as opposed to what we're doing. And the thing is, and I'm about to show you some research, educators often praise mediocre work, especially the work of racial minorities, in an effort to boost self-esteem or convey their lack of prejudice. Praise can be a form of behavior management, manipulation, and control, and a way of communicating low expectations. Overpraising may even accelerate academic disengagement. So, I'm provoking you, and these are evidence-based studies that I'm going to show you. Praise may be a really kind of toxic form of feedback, one that you may not particularly see as toxic initially, but when you place within the notion of growth mindset, it can be, because of that fixed nature of it, and also the way that we use praise as a kind of control mechanism, as opposed to an authentic expression. Now I'm going to take you into this research. So look at this on this post-it here. I'm giving you these comments because I have very high expectations, and I know that you can reach them. So to what extent would this statement alone affect student attainment? What kind of feedback is that? You could pause here. Well, this article, so what this article found, breaking the cycle of mistrust, wise interventions to provide critical feedback across the racial divide. It's, in America, African Americans have a low general trust in schools. They're used to harsher disciplinary actions, colder social treatment, and what they call, in this study, patronizing praise. And what they argued was we should encourage students to attribute critical feedback to their teacher's high standards and his or her belief in the potential to reach these standards. So this idea is moving away from praise and into criticality. And so what they found is they had 3 social studies classrooms. They wrote an essay on a personal hero, and the students received this critical feedback plus a note. I'm giving you these comments so that you'll have feedback on your paper. The treatment. I'm giving you these comments because I have very high expectations and I know that you can reach them. So the teachers don't know who got the treatment. It's double blind, so the students don't know that this is happening, and students are given a week to resubmit their essays. And what we find on the right is the enormous growth in study 1 of the number of particularly African American students who resubmitted their essay simply with that post-it. The only intervention was that post-it. Then later, towards the end of the year, you see a bump in learning progress. Here we see a growth of trust over time. We see that particularly with the lower attaining African American students in particular, was a significant growth in trust. And here's some comments in the paper from students. Teachers give critical feedback, sometimes a lot of it, to students they believe in. It's a hard lesson, but I've come to learn that criticism doesn't mean my teacher sees me as dumb. It means they think their students can reach that high standard. Sometimes people think all the red ink on your pages happens for some other reason, like maybe the teacher's bias. But think of pro athletes or baseball teams that make it to the World Series. Just like in sports, you need that critical feedback to get excellent. The teachers who give me feedback that corrects my mistakes are the ones who really care. They take you seriously, like a good coach does. You might not get good criticism like that all the time in school, but when you get it, it's like gold. This is amazing. This is and here we see the impact on student achievement. And you can see both with the white students and the black students, but particularly the significant growth amongst those African American students. And why? Not out of patronizing praise, but that feedback itself positioned within a rationale and a reason can have an enormous impact on students. So really, strangely, like a session on feedback is actually talking about relationships, your beliefs, your knowledge, and your criticality. And you might want to just pause, and I can send this article around. You might want to read it, and you might want to think about what does this mean for you in terms of your students and in terms of your context. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next section. What do you actually give feedback on? So how do you know what your students are doing? How do you know what success looks like? What's that continuum over the key stages? So we've talked about this in previous podcasts. All the things here we've talked about. Let's just remind ourselves. Success criteria are a really good way of delineating what it is that a student needs to do, what a teacher's commenting on, and what a teacher's taught, and how to give areas for development. You'll notice the word could is there as one means of opening things. So things that are absolutely necessary and things that are open. Success criteria remains a really important tool for self-assessment, for peer assessment. I'm going to talk about that in a second. And of course, for teacher feedback. Teacher feedback that is not directed towards success criteria can sometimes be confusing to the student because they don't know what it is that's being discussed. The more delineated the success criteria, feedback becomes efficient, focused, clear, and effective. I want you to think about, again, a notion of progression, and think about solo taxonomy, or whatever notion you have in your mind of what skills and knowledge progression looks like. Feedback works most effectively when you have that conception in your mind of that progress. So again, going back to this notion. I'm going to take you to the last section, just some possible techniques for effective feedback. So one of the most important ways, and a lot of this now I'm coming back to the work of Shirley Clarke, really a talk-rich classroom, talking partners, and peer marking is really going to be one of the major ways you get feedback. Now, you are yourself around the room, earwigging, randomized picking, comments, hearing, listening, attending to what students are saying, so you don't let them only get away with incorrect information. What is it? Graham Nuthall, Hidden Lives of Learners. I think he talks about, students just, they listen. I wish I knew the percentage of they're not listening to you at all. All their misconceptions are coming out in their talk. Well, you should go around and listen to what they're saying. You don't always have to participate. You should be listening, because what you'll see is when you model feedback, then the feedback they give to one another, that's going to be really important. So it's a skill. Talk is a skill, as we talked about in the second podcast. Peer marking is a skill. It's something that has to be part of your teaching pedagogy for it to work. Randomization is an aspect of practice that, once embedded, will constantly have activity and ways for you to check on how students are talking and about what. So it's really important that you make your students assessment literate, because this is going to lighten your load and your ability to give effective feedback, and also to build that collaborative, social constructivist atmosphere in your classroom. Shirley Clarke, something that's really powerful, I thought, and she does it differently than anyone else, is actually her work on peer marking. So obviously you have so here's how it shouldn't happen, okay? Two students swap books, everybody mark, great handwriting, flip it back, okay? That's not peer marking. For her, peer marking is when both students look at the same book together. And the purple student is the author here. They're looking at the purple student's book first. They hold their pen in their hand, and the other student is the editor and tells them what to write. So if this already requires a kind of talk culture where students are able, and go to Shirley Clarke's website and look at primary school students giving peer feedback to one another, and you will be absolutely gobsmacked at the amount of literacy, fluency, and precision that these students bring to this conversation. It's really remarkable. What the students do is they're not just randomly talking about things like handwriting. I keep talking about handwriting and spelling because these are the things that students, if left to their own devices, end up talking about. But when it's focused very carefully on success criteria, both students end up focusing on those success criteria and comment on it in the book in real time. Out of habit, I use the color purple. When I first was introduced to all this stuff, I get students to do this in purple, but there's no reason it has to be done in purple. So again, I just want to review the key points. The author always has the pen in their hand, sense of ownership, please note, when I have my students doing peer marking, and I have one student who's looking away, I know they're off task immediately, because both students need to be focused on the task at the same time, and there is a collaborative dialogic conversation going on orally and in the book. But the author is the one that records. They're both editing according to success criteria. They're discussing. They can correct in real time. Once you've set a certain amount of time for one book, you move to the next book. Absolutely, this is a skill that needs to be taught. And to move a bit further, it needs to be modeled, it needs to be checked, and it needs to be evaluated. What do I mean by that? Modeled means students need to be shown how to do this. And the best way to do that is the visualizer. In the midst of doing this, it's not a bad idea to check how well students are doing in this process. And they won't do it very well initially, and they will learn to do it better over time. Randomization, pull a book onto the visualizer, check their peer marking, get the blue student to talk about what they see in the purple. Now we move to the evaluation. Pick another stick, get another student in the room to evaluate what the blue student said about the purple student. And what we have here is the building up of a very elaborate discussion, modeling, defining, and then a community evaluation of what's actually going on in learning in real time. And how do we do that? The visualizer. The visualizer is the number one tool to do this, bar none. And what it permits, and I talked about this a little bit in the last video, it permits interaction, real-time modeling, real-time feedback. You can check on progress, and you can give immediate intervention. The document camera offers you all those things like no other tool in the classroom, and it will change the way you teach completely, and it will change the way you give feedback. Absolutely. This last one is a really important way to lighten your workload and also to make feedback actually more impactful. Dylan Williams has an idea of picking 5 books at random every lesson to just check what the students have learned and then to use that to inform the next lesson. That's a really great idea. I've never been able to kind of do that in practice, but what I have been able to do for sure is this, which is whole class feedback. And this, I really would shout out my colleague, Tara Houston, who really helped lead this in the English department with us and has really shown me that this is the one of the best ways to make feedback efficient and impactful. So when you're looking through all these books of a class, what you're doing is you're taking notes on what students are doing well and what they're doing, what are areas of misconceptions or areas they need to work on. This becomes, you type this up in a very small slide. It could be in PowerPoint, for example, and you print this out and get students to glue it in their books, and that is the whole class feedback. The first activity they do when you fed back is to look at these and then to do something, an activity. Either identify, correct, explore, and all students act on this whole class feedback to acknowledge and to look at how does their individual work meet this whole class feedback. This is a really powerful way to show that the learning that students are doing is informing the future planning for teachers. That students are actually engaging and responding to what they're doing, and that it is all completely comment and success criteria driven. It further helps the teacher get a record of what it is that students are progressing on or need to work on, and it informs their own planning in a very powerful way. This is a really important and powerful technique to really make feedback impactful. Okay, so once again, I've talked a lot about, feedback's something we all feel like we know really well. I provoked you. I've got you to think about some things. I just once again want you to remember this axiom. The most effective feedback is just feedback that our students actually use to improve their learning. So when you're doing things like marking a set of books for someone else, not for their student learning, you are not doing the most effective thing that you could be doing. Feedback in and of itself isn't virtuous. It has to be part of a pedagogy. It has to be part of a bigger set of actions for it to be most effective. And both teachers and leaders need to be able to see all those things. So what does that mean? We need a shared language of what we're looking for in the classroom and what we're looking for in the book. You got to think about motivation, growth mindset, comments only marking, remove summative grading from the feedback process. Think about motivation and this idea of wise feedback and how important criticality as opposed to praise is. Think about motivation, sports motivation. I invite you to look at those books if you're interested. Go back to the notion of feedback and success criteria, that feedback driven through success criteria will be more sharp, more focused, more impactful. And this requires a notion of progression, of the idea of open or closed success criteria, which I didn't go into today, but of course you can think about from previous podcasts. And then I've given you some solutions to make it more doable and more impactful. To end, I'm just going to leave you with these two images, and they're what I'm proposing as documents to begin a common language of lesson observation and book looks. And, could you look at these carefully and think about, self-assess. Where are you in this circuit of learning? How does your teaching reflect these things? What are areas that you would need to grow on? What are things that I provoked you to think and learn more about? Techniques, ideas, theory, research that would help you think about these issues in more depth. What are things that you can do when you're observing your colleagues and when they're observing you to get that common language? And how are we going to help leaders, teachers, and students all share a common language for what's going on in the classroom? Because once we have that, the notion of feedback takes on a real solidity, and it really will make a lot more sense and will lead to greater progression of our students' learning, which is what this is about ultimately. For me, everything we're talking about is about teachers' professional growth and confidence, as well as students being able to learn more. So I hope that this video and these videos meet you in good health. I hope I've given you something to think about and provoked your thinking. And in the next podcast, we'll be talking about plenaries, which is the last chapter in the book of Shirley Clark's that we started this journey on. And actually, I'm going to talk more about just the structure of a lesson now. I hope that you're enjoying this, and I'll talk to you soon.